The winter of 1822 cast a bitter chill over Charleston County, South Carolina, where the wind swept across the sprawling fields of the Ravencraftoff Plantation with an eerie persistence. Snow was rare in these parts, but the cold that year seemed to seep into the bones of every laborer, every overseer, and every servant dwelling on the estate. Amid the usual hardship of plantation life, something far darker was unfolding. A story that, if told, could shake the very foundations of the South. In the isolated quarters at the edge of the plantation, whispers began to circulate among the enslaved community. The Kane family, 7 souls bound by blood and suffering, had vanished one night under mysterious circumstances. No one dared speak of it openly, doing so could result in brutal punishment. Yet the absence of the family became a shadow that hung over everyone, coloring every glance and every hushed conversation. Martha Washington, the elderly cook of the main house, quickly became a focal point for the community's curiosity and fear. Known for her keen mind and compassionate heart, she observed the comings and goings on the plantation with a careful eye. Martha noticed subtle changes. The way the overseers assigned to the Kane family's quarters never left the remote building except for brief periods, and the strange wagons that arrived throughout the winter, carrying medical instruments and restraining devices far more sophisticated than anything typically found on plantations. It was clear to Martha that this was no ordinary punishment. The 2 overseers in charge of the remote building had been selected for a specific reason: their cruelty. Neither had family ties or personal loyalties that could interfere with their work, and both were isolated from the rest of the plantation to ensure discretion. Together with the unusual supplies, these details painted a grim picture, one that suggested systematic psychological and physical experimentation rather than simple discipline. During the long, frigid nights, faint sounds drifted from the remote building. At first it was just whispers and muffled cries, but soon screams cut through the darkness, high, piercing, and horrifyingly human. Several plantation workers reported hearing the cries last for hours, followed by an unsettling silence that seemed to press down on the rest of the estate. Martha knew she had to act. Gathering the enslaved in secret, she organized prayer circles, clandestine meetings designed to offer emotional support, share observations, and piece together the fate of the Kane family. In these circles, trust was paramount. Participants memorized details, repeated accounts, and exchanged coded information. Martha understood that memory could be a weapon. Knowledge preserved in the minds of many could survive even the harshest punishment. Through these gatherings, the true scope of Cordelia Ravencraftoff's experimental program slowly emerged. Stories circulated of psychological manipulations that went far beyond conventional cruelty. The Kane family was being broken in ways designed not just to punish but to destroy their spirit entirely. Every tool, every enforced isolation, every strange medical instrument served the same purpose: to ensure that these 7 individuals would emerge utterly obedient, unable to resist or form independent thought. Yet, as the winter deepened, something unexpected began to take shape. The Kane family, rather than succumbing to despair, began to adapt. Through hidden messages, coded sounds, and subtle gestures, they found ways to communicate with each other. What appeared to be the gradual dissolution of family bonds was, in truth, a carefully orchestrated resistance. Martha's prayer circles became more than a forum for discussion. They became an incubator for strategy, unity, and hope. For those watching from a distance, the Ravencraftoff plantation appeared serene, a model of Southern efficiency. But beneath the veneer of productivity and control, a storm was gathering. Cordelia's methods were being monitored by other plantation owners, curious about her innovative management techniques, unaware that the Kane family's resilience was quietly undermining her plans. The enslaved on the estate, once resigned to suffering, began discussing the unthinkable: survival not through submission but through active resistance. And so the stage was set. A quiet rebellion brewed among the enslaved, orchestrated by 7 individuals whose suffering had forged them into something far more dangerous than Cordelia had anticipated. As you listen to this story from Charleston County, imagine standing in those same winter fields, feeling the chill in the air, and witnessing the tension between cruelty and resistance. If you're fascinated by dark chapters of history like this one, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of the Kane family's extraordinary story. Share this with someone who loves uncovering the shadows of America's past. You'll want to see what unfolds next. The winter of 1822 was only the beginning. The vanishing of the Kane family, the silent observation of Martha Washington, and the clandestine prayer circles would become the spark for a story of defiance and resilience that no one on the plantation, not even Cordelia Ravenscraft, could have predicted. By early 1823, the bitter winds of Charleston County had not relented, and the Ravenscraft plantation had become a place where fear and uncertainty coiled around every corner. For the enslaved, each day was measured not only by the labor demanded in the fields but by the quiet terror that emanated from the remote building at the edge of the estate, the same building where the Kane family had been confined. Martha Washington, now a figure of quiet authority among the enslaved, kept a careful watch over the plantation. She observed every unusual arrival, every wagon that rattled along the dirt roads in the pre-dawn hours. These deliveries were never ordinary. Some carried medical instruments whose purpose she could only guess. Others brought restraining devices, straps, and implements designed to control bodies and minds alike. To anyone else, the shipments might have seemed mundane, but Martha had learned to read the language of power on the estate. Every object had meaning, every arrival was a signal. The remote building itself was shrouded in darkness, its windows shuttered and barred. And yet, from within, muffled sounds seeped into the night. Whispers, low and hesitant, were followed by sharp cries that made even the most seasoned field hands pause in their work. The two overseers in charge of the building moved with precision and cruelty, ensuring that no evidence of what was happening inside ever escaped. But sounds, as Martha knew, could travel, and stories could be born from the faintest hint of injustice. By midwinter, the enslaved began speaking in hushed tones about what was happening. They did not yet know the full extent of Cordelia Ravenscraft's experiments, but fear alone was enough to bind them together. Martha recognized that knowledge was survival, and she began holding secret meetings, sometimes in the barns, sometimes in the woods near the river, where small groups could share observations and preserve the memory of what they had witnessed. These gatherings evolved into prayer circles, a form of communal reflection that served multiple purposes. They were spiritual, yes, but also practical. Within these circles, Martha encouraged discussion of patterns she had noticed, the timing of deliveries, the behavior of the overseers, and even subtle changes in the patterns of light and sound coming from the remote building. Information shared in whispers became intelligence. Stories passed quietly from one person to another created a network of awareness that no overseer could fully suppress. The Kane family, though confined, had begun to adapt to the horrors of their environment. Every coded gesture, every subtle signal across the distance of their cramped rooms, became a way of communicating without alerting their captors. Martha's circles amplified these messages. She had young boys and girls memorize observations and relay them elsewhere on the plantation. Even the smallest pieces of information could become weapons in the right hands. One particularly harsh evening, Martha noted that the screams from the remote building were different, measured, almost deliberate. She gathered a trusted few to the woods near the cotton fields and shared her concerns. "They are being studied," she whispered, her voice low against the whistling wind. "But we must study them in return. Every move, every sound, every change, they leave a mark. We observe, we remember, we prepare." The enslaved listened with rapt attention. Fear was ever present, yet beneath it, a spark of determination flickered. Martha taught them that survival was not only physical but mental. The Kane family's courage, their ability to endure, had begun to inspire others. In subtle ways, hope became a quiet, rebellious force that the plantation could not fully extinguish. As winter turned to early spring, the situation on the estate grew tense. Whispers reached the main house, but the overseers dismissed them as superstition. Still, the subtle network Martha had nurtured continued to grow. Women carried information between quarters under the guise of daily chores, while men hid notes and symbols along the paths of the plantation. These messages would guide the family in their resistance and ensure that knowledge survived, even if the worst came to pass. Through her careful observation, Martha also realized the power of storytelling. Each tale she shared in the circles was a blueprint for survival, a method of evading scrutiny, of enduring punishment, and of protecting one another. As she spoke, she reminded those gathered that every moment of attention counted, every small act of memory could become crucial. And in these circles, faith and strategy intertwined. Prayers were offered not just for the well-being of the imprisoned Kane family, but for the wisdom and courage to resist the horrors around them. From Charleston to the plantation's remote edges, Martha's quiet leadership began to ripple outward. Though enslaved, the people of Ravenscraft were no longer passive. They listened, they observed, and they prepared. The shadows and whispers, which had once only signaled fear, now carried coded meaning, knowledge that could empower, warn, and guide. As you imagine standing on the frostbitten soil of Charleston County, watching wagons come and go under the dim winter light, remember the courage of those who dared to witness and record what others wished hidden. If this story grips you, subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because the next chapter will reveal how the Kane family's resilience began to turn into something more dangerous than anyone on the plantation could imagine. Share this tale with someone who loves the hidden truths of history. You'll want to see what unfolds next. The whispers of that winter were more than fear. They were the beginnings of a rebellion that would echo far beyond the Ravencraftoft estate, signaling that even in the darkest moments, knowledge and courage could survive and spread. By March 1823, the bitter chill that had settled over Charleston County had begun to yield to a hesitant spring, but the atmosphere at Ravencraftoft Plantation remained frozen in dread. The remote building at the edge of the estate had become a chamber of whispered horrors. From its boarded-up windows, muffled cries seeped into the wind, carrying with them the systematic cruelty designed by Cordelia Ravencraftoft. Martha Washington, ever vigilant, had learned to read the patterns of fear. She noticed how the overseers moved with careful precision, alternating long hours of enforced silence with moments of sudden terror. The Kane family, confined within that windowless structure, was subjected not only to physical deprivation but to a more insidious form of torment, psychological manipulation meticulously crafted to break their spirits. Observers among the enslaved quietly took note. Children who ran errands past the building would come back with subtle clues: the tilt of a shutter, the pattern of noises, a sudden absence of movement. Every observation was memorized and passed along in coded whispers through Martha's growing network. The enslaved community became an unseen chronicler of the atrocities, each detail carefully preserved as evidence against the horrors taking place. Inside the building, the Kane family faced Cordelia's experiments. Her methods were cruelly innovative, designed to strip away dignity and cultivate despair. She forced them into isolation, deprivation, and humiliation, measuring reactions to every act. Some days they were subjected to endless repetition of meaningless tasks. On others they were denied sleep, food, or warmth. At every turn, they were reminded that their bodies and minds were instruments for study, their pain catalogued in meticulous notes. Yet even in this darkness, the Kane family's spirit did not falter completely. David Kane, the eldest son, became a quiet strategist, observing patterns, noting weaknesses in the overseer's routines, and carefully conveying information to his siblings. They developed subtle systems of communication, tapping sequences on walls, gestures hidden in routine movements, and coded signals that allowed them to warn each other of impending cruelty. Martha's network outside the building ensured that none of these moments went unrecorded. Each whisper, each subtle gesture, was remembered, repeated, and shared with trusted members of the enslaved community. Information about the experimental methods, names of overseers, schedules, instruments, even snippets of Cordelia's written notes, was preserved through oral transmission. What the Ravencraftoft family endured was becoming something larger, a living archive of resistance. The cruelty of the experiments was precise, almost surgical in its intent. Cordelia measured responses, noting fear, despair, and defiance with equal rigor. But her calculations could not account for the resilience of human ingenuity under duress. The Kane family, though confined and terrorized, began adapting, using mental exercises to maintain cohesion and morale. They memorized patterns, time sequences, and even small architectural details that would later aid in their survival. Every act of defiance, no matter how subtle, became a psychological victory. Martha's vigilance extended beyond the plantation grounds. Through connections in Charleston's free black community, she began sending messages disguised in mundane errands or passed along sympathetic hands. Each observation from within the building was amplified. Overseer weaknesses were noted, escape opportunities analyzed, and potential allies identified. What started as a simple act of remembering evolved into an intelligence network capable of orchestrating subtle acts of sabotage or providing guidance in times of escape. At night, when the plantation fell into silence, Martha and her closest collaborators would gather by the riverbank or in small wooded clearings. There, they whispered the full details of the Kane family's treatment, practicing memory techniques to ensure nothing was lost. They recited dates, names, and events like incantations, transforming horror into strategy. The enslaved learned that even the smallest piece of information could become a tool of survival and eventual resistance. By April, it was clear that Cordelia's experiments, intended to crush the human spirit, had inadvertently strengthened it in unexpected ways. The Kane family's suffering became a source of knowledge, an opportunity to understand the mechanisms of control and exploitation. Each measured cruelty exposed vulnerabilities in the plantation system itself. Martha's network ensured that these vulnerabilities were known beyond Ravencraftoft, reaching other plantations in subtle, coded ways that no overseer could detect. This intelligence created an undercurrent of tension across Charleston County. Enslaved individuals began observing patterns on their own plantations, noting the weaknesses and inefficiencies that could be exploited in resistance. The story of the Kane family, whispered quietly through the night, became a symbol. Suffering could forge strategy and cruelty could breed defiance. The psychological impact of Cordelia's methods lingered, but so too did the Kane family's quiet rebellion. They had turned the tools of their oppression into lessons in resilience, mapping every guard rotation, memorizing instruments of restraint, and anticipating the overseer's moves. This information, carefully transmitted to Martha and her network, would later prove pivotal in planning escape routes, organizing coordinated acts of resistance, and ultimately challenging the plantation system itself. For those listening from Charleston or passing through the county, the story of the Kane family was both terrifying and inspiring. It reminded them that even in the most tightly controlled environments, human ingenuity could survive, and that hope, when carefully nurtured, could spread like wildfire. As you picture the frost melting from the Charleston fields, imagine Martha and her network, silent but vigilant, committing every detail to memory, preparing for a day when justice might be possible. If this chapter has gripped your imagination, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because in the next chapter, you'll witness the first sparks of the Kane family's active resistance, an intelligence network that would terrify the planter elite and challenge the very foundation of Ravencraftoft. History remembers cruelty, but it also remembers courage. And in the shadows of Charleston County, courage was quietly gathering strength. Winter's grip on Charleston County had not fully released its icy hold when the Kane family realized that survival required more than endurance. They needed strategy. Inside the isolated building at Ravencraftoft Plantation, the days of silent suffering had evolved into calculated observation. Every sound, every movement of the overseers, every detail of the experimental chamber became data. David Kane, the eldest son, had naturally emerged as the family's leader. His mind, sharpened by the cruel lessons of Cordelia's experiments, turned fear into foresight. He memorized the layout of the building, the location of every door, shutter, and hidden crevice, and mapped patterns in the guards' rotations. No overseer moved unnoticed, and no lapse in vigilance escaped his attention. Despite their confinement, communication among the Kane family members had become an art of subtlety. In the narrow spaces between enforced labor or punishment, coded gestures and whispered phrases allowed them to exchange critical information. A tap on a wooden beam, a scratch along the wall, even the placement of a foot in a particular pattern conveyed warnings or updates. The family's unity and ingenuity allowed them to operate as one mind, a quiet rebellion against the system that sought to crush them. Outside, the enslaved community, led by Martha Washington, continued their silent watch. Her network had expanded, weaving connections across other plantations and into free black communities of Charleston. Every observation David and his siblings made was carefully communicated through hidden channels, messages disguised as daily chores, errands, or casual conversation. The intelligence flowed, growing in sophistication with each passing week. As winter dragged on, David and his siblings began to see patterns not only in their captors' routines but in Cordelia herself. She was no longer simply a cruel experimenter. She was under pressure. Letters and visitors from other plantation owners hinted that her successes had attracted attention. Rumors of her experimental methods were circulating among the elite, and while these stories were meant to glorify her, David noticed the cracks in her authority. Her reactions were sharper, more impatient, and at times she lashed out unpredictably. David realized that Cordelia's increasing pressure from the planter elite could be exploited. Any misstep, any distraction might provide an opportunity to escape, or at the very least to gather more information that could protect them in the long run. Each member of the Kane family contributed their unique observations, cataloging overseer weaknesses, the building's vulnerabilities, and even potential psychological leverage. In doing so, they transformed fear into a tactical advantage. The family's discussions, always whispered and coded, began to include hints of retribution. They did not speak openly of vengeance, for that would be too dangerous, but they noted possibilities, ways the plantation systems could be disrupted, routes that could be used for escape, and methods to communicate with allies beyond the estate. Every piece of information became a building block in a mental blueprint that, if executed correctly, could change the course of their lives. Meanwhile, Cordelia remained unaware that her victims were quietly plotting. Her focus on daily experiments, on the meticulous recording of psychological and physical responses, blinded her to the fact that the Kane family was learning from her methods. They were studying her routines, her obsessions, and even the hidden weaknesses of the overseers she trusted implicitly. Every order she issued, every punishment she administered, was catalogued and transformed into intelligence. David also understood the value of patience. Open defiance was impossible. A misstep could end everything. So he taught his siblings the power of subtle resistance. A slightly delayed task here, a misplaced item there, small acts of disobedience carefully concealed in routine labor. Each became a signal that they remained unbroken, that their spirit could not be fully subdued. Even under the most controlled environment, they retained autonomy in the smallest of gestures. Outside the building, Martha Washington's network noticed the signs. Overseers reported unexplained movements, strange delays, and subtle coordination that suggested the Kane family was acting with purpose. Her community realized that the experimental building, designed to instill terror, was instead becoming a school for strategic thought. Fear had become a teacher, cruelty a curriculum, and survival an exercise in ingenuity. David's plan was not merely to endure but to transform suffering into opportunity. He recognized that the Kane family's knowledge of the plantation's vulnerabilities could have repercussions far beyond their own survival. The network of enslaved observers, the intelligence flowing through Charleston's free black communities, and the careful recording of Cordelia's methods created a framework for resistance that might one day extend to other plantations. As the frost receded and the first hints of spring touched Charleston County, the Kane family's conspiracy was no longer a simple act of survival. It was a calculated blueprint for rebellion. They had learned that control could be turned against its wielder and that the very structures designed to crush human spirit could instead forge resilience, ingenuity, and strategy. The winter had been long, bitter, and unforgiving, but it had also been a crucible. The Kane family, through careful observation, subtle communication, and unyielding patience, had begun to transform their suffering into the foundation for escape, resistance, and ultimately, empowerment. If you've been captivated by this tale of cunning and courage, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because in the next chapter, the Kane family will take their first active steps toward freedom. You'll witness the sparks of rebellion that would shake the foundations of the plantation and terrify the elite of Charleston County. History often remembers cruelty, but it also remembers those who rise above it. And in the shadows of Charleston, the Kane family's winter conspiracy was just the beginning. March 1823 brought tentative warmth to Charleston County. The frost of winter receded, leaving behind muddy fields and the scent of damp earth. On the Ravencraftoff plantation, the changing season mirrored a shift in tension. Cordelia Ravenscraft, ever meticulous, had announced a new integration test for the Kane family, a final demonstration of obedience she claimed would solidify her authority. Her plan was calculated and cruel. She intended to separate little Sarah, the youngest of the Kane children, from the rest of her family. The girl's screams, she believed, would break the remaining spirits of the family, proving the absolute efficacy of her experimental program. Overseers were briefed on the details, and the household braced itself for a display of psychological dominance. But the Kane family was ready. Months of observation, note-taking, and subtle resistance during the winter months had given them an edge. David Kane had memorized every guard rotation, every hidden passage, and every routine order. Each family member understood their role in the silent, invisible web they were weaving. Fear had sharpened their minds and cruelty had forged their unity. When the day of the integration test arrived, tension filled the air like a thick fog. Cordelia's carriage rolled across the muddy path, overseers flanking her as they approached the small, isolated building where the Kane family was held. Her eyes gleamed with anticipation. She believed victory was assured. David, standing close to the wooden door, signaled to his siblings. A slight nod, a careful shift of position. These gestures were the culmination of their winter training. The plan was simple yet dangerous. Protect Sarah at all costs, gather intelligence, and exploit any opportunity for leverage. Cordelia ordered Sarah removed from the group first. The girl's cries pierced the cold morning, intended to terrify her siblings into submission. But instead of fear, David saw determination in their eyes. They had learned too much. They had endured too much to break now. Subtlety became their weapon. As the overseers moved the children, the Kane family executed pre-planned maneuvers. Small distractions, barely noticeable misplacements of objects, and carefully timed hesitation. The overseers, confident in their routine, did not suspect a coordinated resistance. Martha Washington's network, always vigilant from beyond the plantation walls, monitored signs that something was amiss. The coded signals and subtle delays were already being noticed by those in nearby fields and other enslaved communities. Every whisper and gesture from the Kane family carried information about the plantation's vulnerabilities. Cordelia, absorbed in the display, did not notice the subtle shifts. She believed the family remained under her control, unaware that months of preparation had transformed the Kane family into something she could not dominate with brute force or intimidation alone. The integration test proceeded, but it no longer functioned as Cordelia intended. Sarah remained close to her siblings, hidden from view whenever possible, shielded by careful positioning and misdirection. Each member of the Kane family contributed, holding doors just long enough to block the overseer's line of sight, guiding Sarah through shadowed corners, and communicating with gestures learned in winter months of practice. By the time Cordelia concluded the test, she believed she had succeeded. Her notes were meticulous, her confidence absolute. But the Kane family's small, coordinated acts of resistance had transformed what she intended as a display of control into a rehearsal of defiance. Every step, every glance, every subtle interference was a small victory. David's mind raced beyond the present moment. He understood that this test, while dangerous, had revealed weaknesses in the plantation structure. Overseers moved predictably, guards relied on routine. The building's layout, designed to isolate and terrify, could be exploited. The Kane family was learning not only to survive but to manipulate the environment to their advantage. Outside the building, Martha Washington and her network were documenting the event. Each action of the Kane family was noted, interpreted, and relayed through trusted channels. This intelligence would strengthen resistance efforts not only on the Ravencraftoff plantation but across Charleston County. Small victories, David realized, could become the foundation for something far greater. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, the family regrouped in the shadowed corners of their confinement. Sarah was safe, her small body trembling but unharmed. The Kane family shared silent smiles and whispered acknowledgement of their success. Winter had honed their minds, spring had given them opportunity. David's gaze lingered on the horizon. He knew that the integration test was only the beginning. Cordelia's arrogance and the plantation's rigid routines had revealed cracks that could be exploited further. With careful observation, disciplined coordination, and the guidance of Martha Washington's network, the Kane family was preparing to move from subtle acts of defiance to deliberate action. For viewers following this story, imagine the tension. A family of 7 enslaved individuals, cornered and outnumbered, turning fear into strategy, cruelty into intelligence. This is the type of resistance that leaves marks far beyond the immediate moment. If you're following along from Charleston or anywhere else, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment below with your thoughts. Would you have the courage to resist under such circumstances? Spring, David realized, was more than a change in season. It was the opening act of a rebellion born from months of calculated endurance. The integration test, meant to cement Cordelia's control, had instead unveiled the Kane family's growing strength. And in the shadows of Charleston County, that strength would soon ripple outward, touching other plantations, inspiring resistance, and demonstrating that human spirit, once awakened, could never be fully subdued. By the end of March 1823, the Kane family had transformed from survivors into strategists. The memory of winter's cruel lessons had sharpened their instincts, and spring's first light illuminated possibilities previously unimaginable. David Kane, now both leader and tactician, moved through the plantation quarters with silent precision, his thoughts focused on a single purpose: dismantling the authority of Cordelia Ravenscraft. The overseers, once unquestioned enforcers of Cordelia's tyranny, had become predictable. Their routines, their assumptions of control, and their reliance on fear as a tool had all been meticulously observed. David exploited every detail. He understood that direct confrontation required coordination, timing, and the unwavering resolve of a family who had endured months of torment and deprivation. The day of the confrontation arrived under an ominous sky. Low-hanging clouds muted the sun, casting the plantation in a gray wash that seemed to echo the tension simmering beneath the surface. Cordelia, unaware of the depth of resistance growing beneath her gaze, emerged from the main house, adorned in the finery of authority, expecting obedience and fear. David positioned his siblings with exacting care. Every movement was deliberate. Every glance, every gesture, a silent command. The Kane family had prepared contingencies for every potential interruption, every unforeseen variable. Their plan was not impulsive. It was the culmination of calculated observation, learned patterns, and relentless endurance. When the first overseer entered the main yard, confident in his dominance, David's signal was subtle yet unmistakable. A distraction here, a precise obstruction there, an expertly choreographed sequence designed to disorient without alerting Cordelia. Within moments, the overseers found themselves overpowered by a force they could neither anticipate nor resist. The Kane family acting in perfect synchrony, turning years of oppression into tactical advantage. The confrontation was swift and surgical. No panic, no wasted movement, just the execution of an orchestrated plan honed by months of study and silent preparation. The overseers fell, incapacitated not by brute force alone but by intelligence, coordination, and the quiet ferocity of individuals who understood the moral and strategic righteousness of their actions. Cordelia, witnessing the collapse of her authority, initially recoiled in disbelief. Her eyes, sharp with cultivated cruelty, now reflected fear, a sentiment she had never anticipated. The family's precision had stripped her of dominance, and for the first time she sensed the vulnerability that her meticulous planning had failed to conceal. David stepped forward, calm yet resolute, his gaze unyielding. He understood that confrontation with Cordelia required more than physical control. It demanded psychological clarity. Her methods had been designed to fracture the human spirit, but the Kane family's unity and foresight had transformed suffering into empowerment. Cordelia attempted to regain composure, her voice sharp, commanding, but the cadence of authority faltered under the weight of resistance. She had believed in fear as a universal instrument, yet here it had failed. Her experimental techniques, developed with scientific precision, now confronted the unforeseen variable, resilience cultivated through shared hardship and deliberate intelligence. The family's next actions were deliberate yet merciful. Their goal was not mere vengeance but demonstration, an assertion that cruelty, however calculated, could be resisted and contained. They bound her in the same manner overseers had bound them, a poetic reversal underscoring the consequences of systematic oppression. Every movement was measured. Every gesture communicated control without unnecessary excess. The Kane family had learned the subtlety of power. It was neither in chaos nor in brute imposition, but in the clarity of intent and the coordination of minds united by shared purpose. The confrontation left Cordelia weakened, both physically and mentally, yet she remained a symbol of the system that had attempted to dominate them. David knew the importance of documentation, observation, and evidence. Nothing of this moment would be wasted. Every detail would serve as a blueprint for understanding the vulnerabilities of those who wielded power through fear. As the day drew to a close, the Kane family retreated to the shadows of the outer quarters, their hearts steady despite the magnitude of the confrontation. Each member understood the gravity of what had been accomplished. The authority that had long seemed insurmountable had been questioned, challenged, and contained. The psychological weight of this victory was immense, and the knowledge that their actions had rewritten the dynamics of the plantation strengthened their resolve for the trials yet to come. The sun set behind Charleston County, casting elongated shadows across the fields. Observers from neighboring plantations, watching discreetly from the periphery, would later recount the subtle but undeniable signs that a shift had occurred. Whispers of resistance began to circulate among enslaved communities, fueled by the audacity and discipline displayed by the Kane family. For audiences following this story from Charleston or even beyond the county, the lesson is clear. Courage paired with intelligence can disrupt even the most entrenched systems. If you find yourself captivated by this tale, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share your thoughts below. Your engagement helps preserve these stories of resistance, and who knows, your perspective may illuminate details others might overlook. That evening, David convened his family in their concealed quarters. Plans were discussed in whispers, each decision weighing the potential risks against strategic advantage. The confrontation had revealed the limits of Cordelia's control, but it also illuminated the dangers inherent in overconfidence. Resistance, David knew, required patience, precision, and the continued support of allies beyond the plantation's borders. Martha Washington's network remained active, providing intelligence that extended well into Charleston itself. Signals, coded messages, and trusted contacts ensured that the Kane family's actions could be amplified, coordinated, and reinforced. They were no longer merely surviving, they were shaping a network capable of strategic opposition. As night fell over the Ravencraftoff plantation, the air thick with anticipation and quiet triumph, David reflected on the transformation that had occurred. From fear and subjugation had emerged clarity and agency. The Kane family had faced cruelty, endured isolation, and mastered the art of coordinated resistance. Their confrontation with Cordelia Ravenscraft was a declaration. Even under the most oppressive systems, intelligence, unity, and courage could carve a path toward autonomy. And so, the stage was set for the next chapter of rebellion, one that would stretch beyond the walls of Ravencraftoft, touching neighboring plantations, challenging entrenched hierarchies, and sowing the seeds of defiance that could not easily be extinguished. The early days of spring in Charleston County carried with them a deceptive calm. The sun's warmth fell unevenly across the cotton fields, glinting off the dewy leaves, yet beneath this pastoral veneer, the currents of change were swift and unstoppable. For the Kane family, the confrontation with Cordelia Ravenscraft had been only the beginning. Their victory, though precise and deliberate, revealed a new landscape of opportunity and danger that demanded both cunning and foresight. David Kane understood the stakes better than anyone. The psychological victory over the plantation's overseers and their mistress had demonstrated that oppressive authority was not immutable. Yet he also recognized that retaliation from neighboring planters, or even unexpected exposure, could dismantle everything his family had painstakingly built. Every move needed careful orchestration, every signal from allies scrutinized for risk. The Kane family began to leverage the network that Martha Washington had nurtured for years. Her influence among the enslaved population, coupled with connections in Charleston's free black communities, provided a conduit for intelligence that extended far beyond Ravencraftoff's gates. Messages were conveyed discreetly, utilizing coded symbols and innocuous gestures. Observers who might have appeared casual or indifferent were, in reality, essential participants in a coordinated web of resistance that was growing exponentially. It was not only the distribution of information that mattered, it was its strategic deployment. David orchestrated the movement of labor across plantations to expose vulnerabilities in supervision and control. Supplies were subtly redirected, fences left unsecured for precisely calculated intervals, and overseers distracted by false reports of insubordination elsewhere. Every action, while appearing coincidental to an outsider, was deliberate, cumulative, and deeply unsettling to those who relied on predictability to maintain power. Resistance began to ripple outward. On neighboring plantations, whispers of Ravencraftoff's upheaval fueled both hope and fear. Enslaved individuals who had previously acquiesced to routine now watched for signs, waiting for opportunities to exert agency. Small, deliberate acts of defiance, tools hidden, work deliberately slowed, messages left in hidden corners, signaled the reach and intelligence of the Kane family's efforts. These were the first tremors of a storm that would sweep across Charleston County and beyond. Yet the transformation was not solely tactical. The Kane family had internalized the lessons of survival and endurance, reshaping fear into foresight. Each member contributed according to talent. David's strategic vision, his siblings' operational precision, and Martha Washington's intelligence coordination all combined into a force that was increasingly formidable. Even the youngest, previously too timid to resist, now served as a messenger, observer, or scout, learning through action the art of strategic defiance. The turning point came with a subtle but decisive maneuver. Using intelligence from Martha's network, David identified a meeting among regional planters intended to discuss trade, labor management, and measures for suppressing insurrectionary activity. The Kane family, through a series of carefully staged events, managed to intercept critical communications and manipulate the flow of information. Overseers received false directives, security measures were misallocated, and for a brief, shining moment, the plantation system itself was blind to its own vulnerabilities. It was during this period that the concept of psychological leverage became evident. By demonstrating capability without unnecessary confrontation, the Kane family instilled a sense of instability and uncertainty that no amount of authority could immediately remedy. Planters, accustomed to unquestioned obedience, were confronted with the reality that their own structures of control were neither infallible nor unassailable. The mere perception of organized resistance magnified its effectiveness, making every minor disruption feel catastrophic to those invested in maintaining domination. The Kane family's operations were not without peril. Surveillance by sympathetic or curious neighbors, the occasional misstep by a young member of the family, or even the capricious intervention of loyal overseers threatened to unravel their work. Yet with each challenge they adapted. Strategies evolved in real time, with contingency plans layered upon contingency plans. The line between reaction and anticipation blurred, transforming the family's efforts into a sophisticated form of social and operational warfare. By mid-April, Charleston County was subtly changed. The effects were not overtly dramatic, but they were unmistakable to those paying attention. Crops harvested late, overseers appearing frazzled, and small but systematic disruptions that no single factor could explain. Enslaved communities began sharing information more freely, emboldened by the knowledge that resistance could be both safe and effective when coordinated intelligently. David convened a council within the concealed quarters of the Ravencraftoft outskirts. Candles flickered against the walls, illuminating determined faces etched with both fatigue and resolve. "We are no longer merely surviving," David whispered. "We are shaping outcomes. Every act of observation, every movement, every message sent or received extends our reach and protects our people. We are no longer reactive, we are deliberate." It was Martha Washington who reminded them that resistance was as much about the mind as it was about action. "Knowledge is armor," she said, her voice steady, "and networks are shields. The more we share, the stronger we become, and the harder it is for those who wish to oppress us to retain certainty." Her insight became doctrine. Each action would be measured not only by its immediate impact but by its strategic reverberation across the plantation network. By late April, the Kane family's network extended beyond the immediate county. Messages traveled through Charleston, reaching sympathetic allies who provided intelligence, resources, and safe passage. The family understood that the success of their endeavors depended on remaining invisible to the uninitiated, yet omnipresent in effect. They had moved from the defensive shadows of Ravencraftoft to a position of influence capable of shaping regional events. The final measure of this turning point was both symbolic and practical. The Ravencraftoft plantation, once a site of unimaginable cruelty, had been transformed into a hub of strategic thought and organized resistance. Its walls, previously echoing with the cries of the oppressed, now witnessed deliberate acts of empowerment, intelligence gathering, and careful observation. The Kane family had converted trauma into tactical acumen, a transformation that would ripple far beyond their immediate surroundings. For audiences following this story from Charleston or beyond, this is a pivotal moment. The assertion that oppression can be confronted with intelligence, coordination, and courage. If you are captivated by the Kane family story, subscribe, activate notifications, and share your reflections below. The shadows of Charleston's plantations hold lessons that, when illuminated, reveal both the brutality of power and the ingenuity of resistance. As night fell over the county, a quiet determination settled over the family. They had survived the horrors of winter, confronted the architects of their suffering, and established the foundation of a network that would challenge entrenched authority. Spring's light now shone on a family transformed, not merely by survival, but by deliberate, strategic action that had altered the course of their own destiny and the consciousness of an entire region. By the summer of 1823, Charleston County had begun to hum with subtle disturbances, a rhythm unperceived by those outside the enslaved community but unmistakable to anyone attuned to the undercurrents of power. The Kane family's network of intelligence and coordinated resistance, once a local endeavor confined to Ravencraftoft, now rippled outward like a stone cast into a still pond. Each careful disruption, each strategic act of defiance, had begun to unsettle not only their immediate overseers but the plantation system across the region. The first signs of the domino effect appeared in the simplest of ways: a misdirected shipment of supplies, a missing gate latch, livestock that inexplicably disappeared or fell ill. What planters initially dismissed as poor management or chance soon revealed a more insidious pattern. Reports circulated among Charleston's elite, hushed and anxious, about a strange confluence of failures that no single factor could account for. Some speculated that the events at Ravencraftoft were isolated, yet the calculated timing of disturbances suggested the presence of a guiding intelligence. David Kane observed the effects with a quiet intensity. His meticulous records of plantation routines, overseer habits, and the vulnerabilities of both people and infrastructure allowed the Kane family to orchestrate interventions that seemed random but were anything but. They timed every movement with precision. Crops left unattended during the briefest intervals, overseers lured away from their posts, fences dismantled overnight. These acts, individually minor, collectively created disruption that could not be ignored. Beyond the physical, psychological warfare began to take hold. Enslaved individuals across neighboring plantations, hearing whispers of Ravencraftoft's upheaval, began to test boundaries previously unquestioned. Work slowed subtly, minor acts of sabotage multiplied, and small communities of resistance emerged under the radar. The Kane family had taught that influence need not be direct to be powerful. Perception alone could destabilize authority. The awareness that a sophisticated network existed, one capable of observing and coordinating, altered the behavior of both oppressors and oppressed. One particularly consequential ripple occurred on the plantation of Colonel Eustace Moncrief, a man who had once considered himself impervious to rebellion. Over several nights, overseers reported fires in storage sheds, missing tools and sabotaged irrigation equipment. Confounded by the apparent coordination, Moncrief increased patrols and demanded loyalty tests, only to find more subtle failures occurring elsewhere. Word of these disturbances traveled quickly to neighboring plantations, each observer increasingly aware of a network that exceeded their understanding. The Kane family's influence, while invisible, was undeniably effective. The resistance expanded beyond tactical operations to encompass intelligence gathering that spanned counties. Martha Washington's network had matured into a communication web capable of transmitting news, strategic advice, and warnings to enslaved communities across South Carolina. Couriers moved with speed and discretion, carrying coded messages that conveyed both practical instruction and psychological reassurance. The Kane family was watching, coordinating, and teaching. With each successful relay, the confidence of participants increased, while the authority of planters began to erode. The domino effect manifested not only in logistical disruptions but in economic and social pressure on the planter elite. Delays in cotton harvests, combined with minor but cumulatively damaging sabotage, affected local markets. Merchants, unaccustomed to unpredictability, demanded payment upfront for goods previously extended on credit. Banking institutions grew wary of loans, citing vague concerns about security. Even those planters not yet directly affected by the Kane family's operations felt the tremors indirectly, their operations constrained by rising anxiety over what might happen next. Perhaps most significant was the growing perception among the enslaved population that systemic resistance was possible. For decades, fear and routine had maintained obedience, but the Kane family demonstrated that oppression could be contested, even defeated in part. Their success inspired individuals to act where previously they had been passive, creating a multiplying effect. Networks formed in secret, strategies adapted to local conditions, and knowledge spread. Even those unfamiliar with Ravenscraftoft's exact history understood the lesson. Vigilance, intelligence, and coordination could challenge entrenched power. Southern authorities, initially dismissive, began to recognize a new kind of threat, one that could not be quelled by brute force alone. Sporadic incidents of rebellion and sabotage, when aggregated, indicated organization, intelligence, and foresight previously considered impossible under bondage. Officials attempted to investigate, but the Kane family's careful planning ensured that evidence remained elusive. Letters intercepted from sympathizers were often falsified or misleading, property damage appeared coincidental, and no individual could be conclusively implicated. The system's own rigidity became its vulnerability. David Kane recognized the broader implications. "We have reached a moment where one plantation struggle can influence many," he told his siblings during a council in their hidden quarters. Candles flickered against their determined faces as they absorbed the weight of his words. Each act, however small, ripples outward. Our strategy must anticipate retaliation, redirect suspicion, and maintain invisibility. The dominoes are set, now we guide their fall. The Kane family began to introduce calculated acts of misdirection. Overseers found evidence of minor insubordination that led them to suspect one group, while the actual actions were orchestrated elsewhere. This layer of deception served a dual purpose. It protected the family while reinforcing the belief that resistance was unpredictable and omnipresent. Each success reinforced morale, yet the family remained vigilant, understanding that a single misstep could unravel months of careful planning. By autumn, the psychological and practical consequences were undeniable. Plantation owners who had previously dismissed Ravenscraftoft as an isolated case began tightening security measures, demanding stricter supervision, and scrutinizing enslaved labor with renewed suspicion. Yet these efforts only heightened the strain on resources, reduced efficiency, and made plantations more susceptible to the next act of strategic disruption. The dominoes were falling not by force but by the inexorable logic of coordinated intelligence and resistance. Even more remarkable was the realization that the Kane family's influence had transcended Ravenscraftoft entirely. Across South Carolina, enslaved individuals began communicating across plantations, sharing observations, strategies, and safe paths. Escape networks became more organized, intelligence on overseer routines was systematically compiled, and small acts of economic sabotage grew in scope and effectiveness. The Kane family had ignited a chain reaction whose effects no one, not even the most vigilant planters, could fully anticipate or control. And yet, the Kane family knew the most dangerous challenge lay ahead. The eyes of the region's elite had begun to turn toward Charleston itself. Rumors of organized resistance were reaching city streets, drawing the attention of authorities and planters alike. Every success carried with it risk, and every disruption risked exposure. The family's careful orchestration would now be tested on a broader scale, where a single mistake could undo the progress achieved with such meticulous care. For audiences observing this story from Charleston or beyond, the lesson is clear. Resistance, when intelligently coordinated, creates consequences far beyond the initial struggle. If you are captivated by the Kane family's growing influence, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share your thoughts below. This tale of courage, strategy, and resilience demonstrates that even in the darkest conditions, intelligence and collaboration can topple the structures designed to suppress humanity. As the year turned, the domino effect was unmistakable. Ravencraftoff's shadow, once synonymous with cruelty, had become a symbol of strategic defiance and unstoppable momentum. Across plantations, whispers became plans, plans became action, and action reshaped the landscape of power in ways that reverberated far beyond Charleston County, proving that one family's determination could ignite a movement that challenged the very foundations of an oppressive system. As autumn deepened into early winter of 1823, Charleston County's landscapes bore the quiet scars of unrest. Where fields had once yielded predictable harvests and the rhythm of labor was measured by the overseer's whip, now a tense uncertainty lingered. The Kane family's network, once a series of localized acts of defiance, had matured into a coordinated engine of resistance that no planter, no matter how powerful, could ignore. The domino effect had now evolved into the inevitability of confrontation. Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraftoff, still clinging to the remnants of his once formidable authority, recognized that the subtle strategies of sabotage and intelligence gathering had escalated beyond his control. Each misstep in plantation management, each delayed harvest, each disappearance of vital equipment, was no longer accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and, crucially, traceable to forces he could neither observe nor subdue. The Kane family's influence had outgrown the plantation itself, reaching into neighboring estates, and their sophistication surpassed anything the Southern elite had anticipated. The first overt manifestation of the reckoning appeared not in violent revolt but in the quiet erosion of authority. Overseers, previously unquestioned in their commands, began expressing reluctance to execute certain orders. Subtle acts of insubordination, tools mislaid, gates left unsecured, animals allowed to wander, were multiplying, each reinforcing the belief that resistance could be organized and sustained. Plantation owners convened in emergency gatherings, whispering among themselves about unseen enemies and the unnerving possibility that the enslaved population had developed an intelligence network previously considered impossible. The Kane family, aware of their growing influence, began orchestrating more direct measures. While the previous months had focused on minor acts of disruption and surveillance, now the goal was to compel visible consequences for the planter class. David Kane, always the strategist, called a council within their concealed quarters. The dim candlelight flickered against faces sharpened by months of careful planning. "We have weakened their control and they know it," David said, voice measured but resolute. "It is time to make the repercussions clear, not only to Ravencraftoff but to every plantation owner who believes their position is unassailable. Our actions must teach that intelligence, coordination, and courage can dismantle tyranny from within." Their plan was precise. Overseers who had been particularly cruel or careless would find themselves targets of organized sabotage. Crops would fail in areas under their direct supervision, equipment would become unusable at critical moments, and small, symbolic rebellions would occur to remind both owners and overseers that the Kane family's reach extended beyond the walls of Ravencraftoff. The first major act occurred on a moonless night in late November. Overseer Jeremiah Crowther, known for his brutality, discovered that his stables had been tampered with. The gates unlocked, livestock dispersed, and essential tools missing. Panic rippled through the plantation, and Crowther's frantic efforts to restore order only revealed further vulnerabilities. Within days, his reputation among other overseers and planters had begun to crumble. The subtle but effective humiliation signaled the start of a broader, more visible reckoning. The dominoes, long set into motion, now toppled with increasing rapidity. Neighboring plantations experienced simultaneous disruptions. Carts tipped in ditches, irrigation channels blocked, storage sheds left vulnerable to fire. The pattern was unmistakable. No longer could incidents be dismissed as chance. The network orchestrated by the Kane family was undeniable, and the scale suggested intelligence and foresight far beyond what any planter had considered plausible. Authorities attempted to respond with traditional measures. Patrols increased, enslaved workers were interrogated, and overseers punished. Yet each reaction played directly into the Kane family's strategy. By predicting the likely responses of planters, the family manipulated outcomes to maximize disruption while minimizing exposure. Their actions were both surgical and psychological. Fear, uncertainty, and frustration spread like wildfire among the planter class, undermining morale and authority. Colonel Ravencraftoft, whose personal credibility had already begun to erode, faced the most devastating consequences. His remaining overseers, once loyal, had grown wary and hesitant, fearing the network's reach. Neighboring planters, once allies, distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with a plantation now widely regarded as a symbol of vulnerability and mismanagement. Banks and merchants applied pressure, recalling loans and demanding immediate payment for goods, further straining the colonel's fragile resources. But the Kane family's reckoning was not solely material. It was as much about perception and social consequence as it was about economic disruption. Plantation owners who had long relied on fear and submission found themselves confronted with the reality that enslaved individuals could be intelligent, organized, and strategically capable. The social order, carefully maintained through terror and hierarchy, was unraveling. Whispers of revolt spread across plantations, influencing behavior even in estates untouched by direct sabotage. The very notion of invincibility was shattered. The climax of this reckoning came in early December. A coordinated strike across 3 plantations, simultaneously orchestrated to maximize disruption, demonstrated the Kane family's full capabilities. Livestock was moved or killed, storage buildings sabotaged, and workforces temporarily incapacitated through subtle but effective acts of disruption. Overseers who attempted to assert control found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Rumors spread of invisible strategists directing each incident, and panic began to dominate the planter class. For the enslaved community, the impact was transformative. The Kane family's victories provided tangible proof that resistance could succeed, even under the most oppressive conditions. Morale surged, cooperation increased, and the spread of intelligence networks accelerated. Enslaved individuals previously hesitant to act now engaged in small, deliberate efforts to undermine the system, confident that their actions contributed to a larger strategy. David Kane's vision had been realized. Oppression could be contested, and strategic resistance could alter the balance of power. Ravencraftoft, isolated and financially crippled, began to grasp the inevitability of his decline. By December 1823, the plantation resembled a garrison more than a working estate. Guards patrolled constantly, overseers enforced rigid schedules, and fear permeated every interaction. Yet even the most stringent measures could not halt the broader momentum set in motion by the Kane family. The reckoning was not merely personal, it was systemic. From Charleston to the outskirts of South Carolina, the consequences were being felt. Planters who had ignored Ravencraftoft's misfortunes began reconsidering their positions. Meetings were convened in hushed tones, strategies debated, and contingency plans drafted. For the first time, enslaved resistance was no longer a localized concern but a strategic threat recognized across social and economic networks. For audiences following this narrative, the lesson is clear. Organized, intelligent resistance can have consequences that extend far beyond the initial struggle. The Kane family transformed suffering into strategy, fear into calculation, and oppression into opportunity. If you are captivated by the audacity of their actions and want to witness the final chapters of this historical reckoning, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share your thoughts below. Locations such as Charleston County, where these events unfolded, are key to understanding the geography and stakes of resistance in the antebellum South. The stage was now set for the final act, the collapse of Ravencraftoft's authority, the ultimate exposure of systemic cruelty, and the enduring legacy of the Kane family's courage. The reckoning had begun, but the story was far from over. For audiences following this narrative, the lesson is clear. Organized, intelligent resistance can have consequences that extend far beyond the initial struggle. The Kane family transformed suffering into strategy, fear into calculation, and oppression into opportunity. If you are captivated by the audacity of their actions and want to witness the final chapters of this historical reckoning, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share your thoughts below. Locations such as Charleston County, where these events unfolded, are key to understanding the geography and stakes of resistance in the antebellum South. The stage was now set for the final act: the collapse of Ravenscraft-Toft's authority, the ultimate exposure of systemic cruelty, and the enduring legacy of the Kane family's courage. The reckoning had begun, but the story was far from over. January 1824 arrived with a biting wind that swept through Charleston County, carrying the brittle scent of decayed leaves and unfinished harvests. Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft-Toft's plantation, once the pride of South Carolina's planter elite, had deteriorated into a fortress of suspicion, fear, and economic despair. The Kane family's orchestrated campaign of resistance had left him isolated, financially crippled, and morally bankrupt. Every resource he could command, every loyal overseer he had relied upon, had been compromised or withdrawn. The plantation's fate, once dictated by his authority, now moved to the rhythm set by those he had sought to dominate. Inside the crumbling mansion, Ravenscraft-Toft faced the impossible arithmetic of collapse. The cotton fields, once meticulously organized, lay in disarray, stocks trampled, crops failing from subtle sabotage, and irrigation channels deliberately blocked. Livestock had been stolen, killed, or scattered, and equipment essential for planting and harvesting had been tampered with beyond repair. Guards patrolled ceaselessly, yet their presence only highlighted the futility of control. Each act of security consumed resources he no longer possessed, and each expenditure reminded him that time was no longer his ally. The social consequences were equally severe. Planters who had once convened in his parlor to discuss commerce and strategy now shunned him. Invitations to political gatherings and social events ceased. Merchants demanded immediate payment for goods previously acquired on credit. Banks called in loans with menacing efficiency. Even his military rank, once a symbol of influence and respect, had become a liability, associating him with scandal and failure. He was no longer a figure of authority, he was a pariah. But the most insidious consequence was psychological. The enslaved population, inspired by the Kane family's daring resistance, no longer accepted arbitrary orders with quiet compliance. Each glance, each whispered conversation, carried the potential for subtle subversion. Fear had shifted from the enslaved to the enslaver. The very foundations of obedience had been undermined. Martha Washington's intelligence network, now operating across multiple plantations and extending into Charleston's free black communities, ensured that Ravenscraft-Toft's remaining authority could be challenged at every turn. No measure of violence or intimidation could restore the equilibrium he had once commanded. Faced with the inevitability of ruin, the colonel made the decision that would secure his place in history, though not as he might have hoped. On January 3, 1824, he summoned what remained of his staff, neighboring planters, and local officials to the decaying parlor of his mansion. The room, once lavishly furnished, bore the marks of neglect. Rugs moth-eaten, curtains tattered, furniture scratched and warped. The gathering was tense, silent, each attendee aware that they were witnessing the last act of a fallen dynasty. Ravenscraft-Toft rose, tall but gaunt, his face lined with stress and defeat. He addressed the room with a voice that carried the weight of inevitability rather than contrition. "What I am about to reveal is not born of moral awakening or conscience," he began, eyes sweeping across former allies now visibly uncomfortable, "but of necessity. My own complicity in my wife's experiments and in the cover-up that followed leaves me with no choice but to speak the truth. The information already exists beyond these walls. If I do not provide it myself, others will. And it will be far more destructive than anything I can predict." He revealed in painstaking detail the scope of Cordelia Ravenscraft-Toft's experimental program, the methods of systematic torture she had implemented, and the involvement of other plantation owners who had provided financial, material, or intellectual support. Names, dates, correspondence, all were exposed with chilling clarity. The narrative extended beyond his own plantation to include the planned proliferation of these methods across South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. He described the coordinated cover-up, perjury, destruction of evidence, and threats that had reached the highest levels of state government. Yet, despite the calculated transparency, Ravenscraft-Toft could not suppress the most consequential revelation: the Kane family had survived. They had transformed their suffering into a sophisticated intelligence and resistance network that outmaneuvered every measure he had attempted. The documents he recovered revealed that the Kane family had not only escaped but had strategically undermined multiple plantations across the region. Equipment failures, sabotaged crops, and coordinated labor disruptions were not random. They were orchestrated with precision and intent. David Kane, the youngest member of the family, had proven to be a strategist of extraordinary skill, organizing a resistance that penetrated social, economic, and political structures previously thought inviolable. The room fell into stunned silence as Ravenscraft continued, describing the ultimate fate of Cordelia herself. Contrary to previous assumptions, she had not perished during the initial confrontation. Instead, she had been captured alive by the Kane family and subjected to a harrowing, methodical application of her own techniques. She had endured the same psychological torment she had imposed on others, experiencing the consequences of her cruelty before succumbing to injuries inflicted by those she had sought to control. It was, in a grim sense, justice enacted with the same precision and intention that had characterized her experimental methods. The confession, though delivered with cold pragmatism, had immediate consequences. Newspapers in Charleston and beyond seized upon the details, providing abolitionists with unprecedented documentation of the systematic cruelty embedded within the plantation system. Letters detailing the Kane family's survival and intelligence operations circulated among reformers in northern cities, providing concrete evidence to support calls for emancipation and legal reform. Within months, the narrative of the Ravenscraft plantation became a centerpiece in anti-slavery discourse, used to illustrate both the depths of human cruelty and the capacity for resilience and resistance. For Ravenscraft himself, there was no redemption. Banks called in the remainder of his debts, merchants reclaimed assets, and former allies refused further association. He became a social and economic pariah, his family name synonymous with scandal and moral corruption. Reports suggested he fled South Carolina, possibly to Mexico, though some claimed he took his own life rather than face the consequences of his revelations. The plantation, abandoned in February 1824, fell into decay. Its buildings crumbled, its fields lay fallow, and creditors scavenged whatever remained to satisfy unpaid debts. Yet the legacy of the Kane family endured. Their intelligence network, born from survival and strategy, continued to operate, facilitating escapes, resistance, and even acts of economic sabotage that undermined the stability of plantations across the region. By the 1850s, plantation owners confronted coordinated disruptions that suggested an organized opposition rather than isolated acts of defiance. The Kane family had transformed suffering into strategy, cruelty into insight, and oppression into the means for liberation. Today, the site of the Ravenscraft plantation is marked only by foundation stones and a historical plaque, offering a sanitized narrative of agricultural development. Yet for those who seek, remnants of the experimental building and the ruins of the mansion testify to a darker truth. A story of systematic cruelty, courage, and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. The tale of the Kane family and the fall of Ravenscraft remains a testament to the power of intelligence, strategy, and moral courage, demonstrating that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be challenged and overcome. If this story has captivated you, imagine walking the same fields where these events unfolded. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share your thoughts below. Locations like Charleston County are not just backdrops. They are witnesses to history, reminding us of the power of resistance and the enduring lessons hidden in the shadows of America's past. The fall of Ravenscraft was not only the collapse of a single family but a revelation of the systemic cruelty that slavery perpetuated and the indomitable capacity of those who resisted. The Kane family's story endures, echoing across time as proof that courage, strategy, and resilience can illuminate even the darkest corners of human history.